Hello and welcome to Pensions in 10 with me, David Brooks, and just me. So completely my fault, mixed up with someone's calendar, and I wasn't able to find a last minute substitute to come in. So doing something different and brand new, doing it on my own. So if this works, I might do it again sometime, but it probably won't work because it's much nicer to have another person's voice, another person's face to look at or listen to than mine. So this will be an anomaly, I'm sure. But anyway, on we go. This week, I'm going to be talking to you about the default consolidator model, the Regulator's Innovation Hub, and the Pensions Regulator's blog on Superfunds. Okay, so the first story to talk to you about today is the report from the Small Pots Delivery Group. So they've been thinking about how we can deal with the problem of the proliferation of small pots, this long understood issue that people become disconnected from their DC pension pots, forget they're there, people lose track of them, and this is happening a lot, exacerbated massively by auto enrollment. So people are auto enrolled for a few months or a year or so, and then just move on to another job and start a new pot all over again. So the numbers being bandied around are up to around 12 million of these pots that are kicking around, depending on your size definition. So we've got to try to deal with this somehow. And so the Small Pots Delivery Group have reported, and the government have sort of responded to that. So in this report, there's lots of recommendations and discussions, and then the government are making decisions on how they're going to take this forward. So the first go at this is basically they're going to look at pension pots with less than £1,000 in them, and then automatically consolidate them together. There will be a group of authorised providers who will become consolidators. There's a bit of discussion in there about what sort of schemes they will be. So likely to be schemes that are already auto-enrollment compliant, have things like Sharia funds. There does seem a bit of a inference that primarily they'll be trust-based schemes, so some of the master trusts, but there's definitely a desire to use GPPs as well. So the FCA are going to be thinking about how they do that, so how they authorise those funds. There's going to be a big system, which I might touch on in a second, but there's a big system running behind all this to make sure that people can be contacted and members can be identified and then connected to a scheme. So there's going to be a member interaction in that as well. So members can effectively opt out if they don't want to be consolidated in the way that the system will do it. And the aim is that this is going to reduce cost for everybody. So hopefully members have a better outcome because they're not having their funds depleted by ongoing charges, but also in actual, when you look at the details, some of the administration costs for running a pot do have a base, and sometimes the actual fee that's coming out of the pot for the administration won't cover the cost of the provider. So there's an expectation that it will eventually save the industry money as well, which makes a nice change, I suppose. So a lot of the thinking in the background is going to be around how you identify these people. We've already got the pensions dashboard coming through. And so there's been lots of work around identifying people, but in this case, it will be happening not necessarily with that individual's initially anyway, with their engagement. So it'll be based on whatever the systems can hold. And then it's identifying which pots to be consolidated and then where. And if they already have a pot in a larger consolidator, one of the consolidator schemes, then that will automatically go there. If they've got multiple pots, it will go to the larger scheme. If they don't have any pots in one of the consolidator schemes, then there's likely to be a carousel system. So whatever the next scheme is, you'll get put into there. And at that point, the member will be contacted to see if they want to do it. So this is going to probably come through in the pension schemes bill, which we're expecting in the summer, and come into force by 2030. But I think a lot of the challenges will be around that, the systems and how they work and how they interact, how you make sure that the transfers happen efficiently and safely, and make sure it all works as smoothly as possible. So a first step, just one other thing as well, I suppose, the dashboard, a lot of people will be saying, what's the point? We've got a dashboard, isn't that going to solve the small problem? And the dashboard delivery group do discuss that in there, because they accept that the dashboard will result in some member-led consolidation, but it was felt that it wouldn't be anywhere near enough. We may yet see the dashboard may get launched in the next year or so and be a rip-roaring success and deal with lots of these problems, but I think we are planning for that potentially not to be the case, and so pressing ahead with this solution. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk to you about was a speech by the Pensions Regulator, represented by Patrick Coyne, who is Interim Director of Policy and Public Affairs. He was speaking at the Pensions Age conference, and so some of my moles were there and they reported back. I wasn't able to make it myself, but apparently he was talking about the Innovation Hub. So this is something that the regulator has talked about before. I think it was in their digital strategy that may have been announced last year or early this year. Can't remember, but it's definitely been something that we've mentioned on Pensions in 10 before, and it's definitely something that the regulator has spoken about before. So they are now going to launch that in the summer. So this is a space for new ideas to be discussed and new ways of doing things to be discussed, and perhaps foster some better collaboration amongst the industry. They're noting that they're going to be focusing initially anyway on emerging models. So new ideas for the way of delivering pensions and perhaps outcomes for members and how these can be improved. And we know there's a few ideas banging around. Perhaps the DB saver idea, the Superhaven, might get discussed in there, but there might be other ones as well. So we'll wait and see what comes through. And of course, data is the biggest thing at the moment, as we're all talking about it. Easily relatable to the previous story we talked about, the consolidation of small pots. So the quality of data would underpin the success of that, and future outcomes will also be based on data. And decumulation is a big challenge at the moment. Again, we're expecting some things in the pension schemes bill around DC default decumulation models, but any improvements and any new ideas that can be used and brought to the table to make decumulation easier for people, I think that's something that's going to be a big challenge for pensions for the foreseeable future, as more and more people retire with DC pots and get that challenge of trying to deal with the majority of their income coming from a DC private savings. So you get a state pension and then a DC pot on the side. How do you make those two things work together? How do you optimize your income? How do you make sure your investments are properly structured, to avoid spending too fast, or even the opposite and equally bad outcome of spending too slowly? So that is the big challenge that I think will come through in the Innovation Hub. So yeah, looking forward to seeing what that's like, hoping to be involved in some way when it comes through. So the Innovation Hub is on the way. So my final thing I want to talk to you about today was a blog written by David Wormsley on the Pensions Regulator website around what's colloquially known as Superfunds or DB consolidators. I'm sure the people at Clara still bristle slightly at being referred to Superfunds, but anyway, that's the name that seems to have stuck. It won the award as the name that most people associate with DB consolidators. So the regulator notes that it's done, or Clara has done 3 deals, with the first in late 2023, Sears, I think it was called, and then Debenhams and Waits later on. And they're issuing this as a sort of a top tips to how schemes can interact with Clara and potentially other super funds that might come through. So as we know, we've got the gateway tests, and they're talking about there are funding tests you need to be able to qualify before the regulator will be willing to sign off when you're going into one of these private sector consolidators. So one of the top tips they give here is you don't necessarily need to get a buyout quote before proceeding towards Clara and the like. So that's helpful. That might save some time, as long as you've had an appropriate advice on working out whether it's affordable. Trustees of transferring schemes don't need to do detailed due diligence on the super fund arrangement, because TPR is all over it. They'll be doing that for you. And some of the background around how you decide whether you should go forward into it are discussed, and also some of the issues around if market movements change the state of play, and they're saying that you get about 30 days basically grace. So if things change very dramatically, if we have another budget like we had in 22, or similar events can also impact your prices and asset values. But once you've committed, you're sort of protected to continue, and you won't be held to account if things change, and perhaps you were better funded and you probably should have gone for a full buyout with an insurer instead. So it's very useful, very interesting. Regulators estimating that around 40% of schemes could possibly go through that gateway test. That's interesting. And it's noted as well that smaller schemes probably will come through, and it will be easier for them to do that. Again, the pension schemes bill in the summer is likely to have more on the legislative framework around how these super funds work, and so that might make it a bit easier for smaller schemes to look at Clara and the like, and decide whether they want to proceed. So very helpful blog from the pensions regulator, an interesting and developing area. Perhaps there's the sort of thing we'll see through that innovation hub as well, of sharing of ideas, new ways of working, how things can adapt perhaps more quickly. If we're in a world where we don't necessarily want to have to wait for let's use the DB funding code as an example of something that perhaps took too long to get through lots and lots of reasons, not least pandemics and elections and all other things as well. So it did have a few obstacles in its path. But if we can get in a position where the regulator is able to react to the changing world a lot faster, it might be that means better outcomes for savers, better outcomes for members, better outcomes for trustees and employers, if things can adapt and move with the changing times. So perhaps that's the way we're going to see things working in the future. And, hopefully that's a good thing. Okay, that's it for this week. Hopefully that wasn't too painful, just listening to me waffle on to you. Don't forget, you can subscribe via our website if you want these to drop into your inbox each week without having to remember to look into LinkedIn. Otherwise, please like, share, comment, or anything else you'd like to do. Give us some feedback, and we look forward to seeing you, hopefully, with somebody else sat next to me next week on Pensions in 10.